Your thoughts on the game last night as that was I saw a stat where that was the biggest win, biggest deficit in bowl history, which was flashed up there late after the game. So I imagine people were digging through bowl records to find that. But nevertheless, that was just an absolute demolition. Congrats to TCU for getting there. That was not a game for long. And boy, this Georgia program really feels like the Alabama program with Nick Saban in its prime at its height. I think Saban's come back to the pack just slightly, but the number one class in recruiting. Caleb, that was over before it started.
Yeah, it was. I'm going to make a bold statement here and stand by what I said yesterday that Tennessee would have had an easier time with Georgia in a playoff semifinal than they would have had with TCU. Yeah, I know. I'm still saying that. And
How can you possibly go there after what we saw last night?
because we knew my premise was based on the fact, and it still was based on this fact, that Georgia wouldn't have been as focused and gone all in playing Tennessee as they were playing TCU last night. We saw this with Georgia all year. This Georgia team that just blew out TCU was trailing Missouri by 10 in the fourth quarter earlier in the year. So we've talked this was a Georgia team. If it was a national championship game, yes, Georgia would have blown Tennessee out. But in a semifinal, Georgia didn't keep their focus all year. They had 9 days to prepare for this game. They had plenty of time to be fully focused and fully excited. They weren't looking ahead of anything. It was a chance to finish 15-0. Psychologically, they were all there. And so obviously when that happens, they're on a different stratosphere of talent than TCU, so they blew them out of the water.
Well, let's first of all, Tennessee would have fared better against Georgia than TCU, and I feel confident in saying that. Had there been some sort of rematch where Tennessee, by the way, finishes number 6th in the AP Top 25, had Tennessee been able to, which is stupid, they should have been ahead of Alabama. But had Tennessee been able to get to a championship game against Georgia, they would have fared better against TCU. Not only did they fare better in Athens, but you could tell at different times by things the commentators would say. I mean, I heard Chris Fowler at one point after the game said, "Yeah, I thought this was over in the middle of the second quarter." Well, at that point, it was just about a 10-point lead. And you could say that, and I get that, but just the sense of all the commentators referring to this was a way, way, way outmanned TCU team. And it was. So Tennessee talent wise wouldn't have been that outmanned. And I'm talking about the guys up front primarily. Tennessee's offensive line has been a strength this season. And then on the flip side, the defensive line has had its moments at least. But on the line of scrimmage, you could watch the first quarter and realize really quickly, Caleb, that TCU just couldn't compete with Georgia's big guys. It just was not going to happen last night.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. And I don't think I think matchup wise, TCU was not. There's never a scenario where you could see TCU catch Georgia napping per se, because even if Georgia's napping, TCU doesn't have the personnel. The way they're built, they're not really gonna be able to take advantage of any sort of matchup issues because again, they're an air raid offense. Even when Georgia's sleeping through games, their secondary is pretty darn good at shutting down receivers, quite honestly. And so, I think I just saw Travis K say TCU moved up a spot in the AP. I get that. I mean, they did beat Michigan. People are trying to say TCU shouldn't have been there now, but I'm like, guys, TCU did beat Michigan the week before. And are we saying Michigan shouldn't have been there? We all agreed they were undefeated and won the Big Ten. They should have obviously been there. So, but I agree in terms of just actual talent. Look, the college football playoff is not about the 4 most talented teams. We have to be clear about that. It's about the 4 best teams or with the 4 teams with the best body of work, I would say. And do I think TCU doesn't come close to Georgia talent wise? Tennessee comes much closer to Georgia talent wise. I don't think there was a scenario where TCU could have caught Georgia napping. I do think there are scenarios where TCU could have caught other teams napping that would be capable of catching Georgia napping, if that makes sense.
Well, and actually, I don't know if you in the bedlam after the game, I don't know if you saw this interview, but Stetson Bennett said that heading into that Ohio State game that they didn't prepare as well as they should have, which I thought was a really interesting peek behind the curtain. I don't know why they didn't, but maybe they just thought they had Ohio State in hand. So that was the worst possible mixture heading into the championship game. A Georgia team that didn't think they played well the week before, but survived. So now they're uber motivated. They said they were hitting, which this reminds me of the Dallas Cowboys in the early 90s. They hit the week before the Super Bowl, full pads, which sounds insane. But Georgia said that a couple of different people said they were hitting in full pads last week in what essentially would be their Wednesday workouts, which last week would have been Friday, Saturday. So if you look at it like a game week, they were essentially hitting on their normal days, which a lot of people don't do. You get to that point and you back off the throttle to make sure everybody's healthy. That's the scary thing about this Georgia team. And Georgia has such depth right now that it feels like a plug and play system. The Big 12, I mean, kudos to TCU for getting to that point. But I think what we have learned is that if you're talking about the top 2 or 3 teams, it's clearly the SEC. Okay. And then number 2 is going to be the Big 10. Now, would you rather be in the SEC or Big 10 where yeah, out of the group, I would rather be in the Big 10. As far as advancing to a college football playoff, I'd rather be in the Big 10. I've got my one challenging game, basically, which is Michigan or Ohio State, depending which you are. And then I have maybe sort of Penn State as a challenging game, right? In the SEC, you've got 2 or 3 really, really, really challenging games, a couple more that are pretty challenging. At the Big 12, you're 1 to 8 pretty good. So as far as advancing to the college football playoff, I would much rather be in the Big 10 than either the Big 12 or the SEC. Do you agree or disagree?
Yes, but because we still have divisions in college football, I think it depends. And on a macro scale, much rather be in the Big 10. But I'd rather be in the SEC East than the Big 10 East. Big 10 East is where you have Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State,
Oh,
and
yeah.
SEC East is, yeah. But you're right. The Big 10 West is so, I mean, Big 10 West is barely a Power 5 division, if you ask me. Purdue won that division this year, and they finished 8-5. And so, that's a horrible division.
I tell you what, I know both the games were close, and I know Ohio State pushed pushed Georgia to the brink, but I think Tennessee matches up well after watching them against quality competition against teams that can throw the ball, and I include Georgia in that respect, even though we think of them as rough, tough, and all that stuff. But I think Tennessee would have matched up fine with Michigan or Ohio State. I really do. Call me crazy, but I think they would have been just fine. I'm not saying they would have won, but I think they would have competed.
I agree. I said yesterday, and I'm standing by it. They would have matched up better with Michigan or Ohio State than they would have with TCU. Even after what we saw from TCU last night, TCU had the perfect recipe to give Tennessee hell in a game. And that was that secondary. And I mean, on top of that, if you have your best linebacker out like you did against South Carolina and your defensive line is just having an off day, I mean, you have a recipe for if South Carolina could put up 63 points on Tennessee's defense with a quarterback playing well, we know Max Duggan and TCU could. So I'm with you. I think Michigan and Ohio State were better matchups, largely because you sometimes the only reason Ohio State's a little bit tricky is TCU runs the air raid. Ohio State, I mean, how many NFL receivers do they have on that team? We're talking like 4 that could be top 2. Yeah.
I was told by Chris Landry, friend of the program, they probably have 4 first rounders.
Yeah, 4 first rounders, and we know Tennessee's issues in the secondary. They couldn't have hung with any of those receivers. So the question would have been if CJ Stroud would have just been able to get him the ball, and Stroud is a little bit inconsistent. But I don't think Ohio State could have stopped Tennessee on the other side.